started, even though there's really not that many people here. It is 8 o'clock, and I put it up normal time, so it's giving people a chance to get here. So might as well get started. The test tomorrow, quiz, whatever you want to call it, is 35 questions. It will be retakeable, and there you can do corrections as well. So hopefully you're not too worried about it, but there are 3 note pages, note things that you really should kind of pay attention to in your studying. So let's kind of take a look through those real quickly. We're going to be moving fairly quick just for the sake of efficiency tonight. If you have any questions, don't be shy and don't be afraid to put them into the chat. Alright, so here we go. Number 1, the first thing we're going to talk about is kind of some of the key events of the Cold War, right? So let me get this up and going here. Can everyone hear me? Can we tell me if we're... I didn't check to make sure the audio is working properly. I'm going to turn the captions on just to see how they work tonight. So it looks like they're working pretty well, and we're going to get going. Okay, so key events, right? So the big thing that we need to kind of keep in mind is that the Cold War begins really kind of immediately, more or less following the end of World War II, right? So what we can say really is kind of this in between, 1945, 1948. It's questionable maybe, but at really kind of at that point, that's kind of where we're talking, right? And it's going to go all the way until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, right? The collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall a bit earlier than that. So anyway, let's begin, right? So the scene kind of gets set at what's called the Yalta Conference, which is actually in February 1945, which is actually before the World War II ends, right? World War II ends really in August after the dropping of the atomic bombs and the surrender of Japan. You're going to have Germany surrender in May, and kind of prior to that, you're going to have the meeting of the Big Three, and the conclusion of World War II is more or less decided at this point. So these people, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill in particular, are going to be coming together to kind of to discuss and to decide what's going to happen in a post-war Europe. And the big thing that you really need to get out of this is the agreement to divide Germany and Berlin, the capital city here, into 4 different occupation zones, right? So there are our 3 people. You should familiarize yourself with the names and faces of these people a little bit, just because they possibly could come up tomorrow. Okay, so we know that Germany is a little bit tricky right after the war, right? We are going to kind of get a West Germany and an East Germany, right? So West Germany is broken up into the Allied zone, which is actually broken up further, into, you have French, American, and British in particular, right? Who were the Allies mostly fighting in the war, right? So in East Germany, it's going to be given to the Soviets, right? So it gets tricky though, because the capital city Berlin, as you can see on this map, is actually well within East Germany itself, right? So if we further break up Berlin in a very similar fashion, kind of 4 different zones, you can see the Allied zone there, really small there. In the western part of Berlin, you get the French and the British and the American zones. Initially before it just becomes the West Berlin. That really, it sets the tone for some of the early problems in the Cold War, right? So let's kind of go into that, right? So the effects, it began, you're going to have this feeling of mistrust between Stalin and the West in particular kind of coming out of Yalta. Stalin's going to make some promises for free elections in Eastern Europe. The Allied leaders are fairly skeptical and Stalin hopefully really wants to create what he considers a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the West, right? So Eastern Europe in particular would act as this buffer zone following the war, which is part of the reason why he's happy to claim it and push all the way into Germany during the war, right? Because it will act as this buffer after the war, right? So they regain control of much of Eastern Europe, and they're going to create these satellite Soviet nations, right? That's what the USSR kind of stands for. It's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, right? So there are multiple republics in this Soviet sphere, right? So as far as objectives from the 3 different leaders that you should be familiar with, right? Stalin's objectives is kind of post-war economic assistance for Russia, Additionally, he wants recognition by the United States and Britain of this Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Churchill, if he had to pick for things, he wants protection of the British Empire being the most important in his mind, but he also wants to clarify a post-war status of Germany, right? And then Roosevelt, in particular, he's looking to push this establishment of the United Nations, and ultimately, he wants to gain Soviet agreement to enter the war against Japan once Hitler was defeated, right? This is coming out of Yalta, which was, again, prior to the end of the war. At the end of Yalta, no one's really going to be completely satisfied and get everything that they want because they needed to make agreements and compromise in some capacity, right? So, anyway, at the end of this, you're going to, so this is just kind of actually, a map of Cold War Europe. This kind of extends later on into the 1950s and 1960s and even 1970s, I would say. And you're going to get this division between the communist East, right, and the capitalist West, right? And you're going to get the Berlin Wall, which is going to exist in the middle of Berlin, right, kind of right around there. And you have what becomes known as the Iron Curtain, dubbed by Winston Churchill, that is going to basically make this border, right? And there's no actual real physical Iron Curtain that extends across, right? But ultimately that's kind of the language that Winston Churchill is deciding to use to signify the difference between the old states of Europe and the capitalist and democratic states versus the communist states in the East that had fallen under the Soviet sphere of influence. So that's kind of what I was just saying, right? You're going to get this rivalry between America in particular and the Soviet Union, America being the lone superpower following the end of World War II. And you're going to get this democracy versus dictatorship and capitalism versus communist, right? And ultimately, the United States, how Harry Truman, the president after Roosevelt dies, responds is issuing what becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, and this is going to be really important. So the Truman Doctrine in particular describes this policy of containment, right? And the whole idea of containment is trying to keep communism where it is, right? They're not going to really be aggressive, and they're not going to attack communism or anything like that. But ultimately, what they want is they don't want it to spread out any farther, right? They fear what's called domino theory, that if communism it'll keep going, right? If it spreads to this country, it'll kind of knock the next one and the next one and the next one, and ultimately communism will continue to spread. So what the Americans are trying to do post World War II is ultimately what they're trying to do is effectively not allow that to happen, right? To contain communism as much as they possibly can. Okay, so the Soviets, however, they have their eyes on Berlin, right? And they don't like the idea that there is a capitalist bastion, right, sitting in East Germany, and they effectively try to cut off Berlin from the outside and outside supplies. They block the train routes, they block road routes and things like that, and don't allow the West into West Germany, East Germany to be able to do this. So the West responds with something called the Berlin Airlift, right? And this is just this continuous action and continuous motion of airplanes dropping resources and supplies into West Berlin so that they would not fall into the Soviet sphere. This Berlin Airlift is going to actually last almost an entire year, 11 months, before the Soviets admit defeat and lift this blockade, right? They admit that the Americans are going to just continue to do this and the Allies are going to continue to do this, and they just kind of give up and allow the access again. Okay, so there's just some pictures anyway. So anyway, you're going to get the presence of nuclear weapons as well, right? So the Americans are going to have them initially, and that kind of dictates a lot of the action here during the 1940s. But ultimately, the Soviets are going to also achieve the bomb in 1949, and this is where you're going to get what's called the arms race, right? The arms race is constantly seeking larger bombs and more tactical bombs, better bombs, right? They just keep getting bigger and bigger, and ultimately you're going to have this what's called theory of deterrence, right? So that effectively you have this idea called mutually assured destruction, that if someone's going to use a nuclear weapon on the other, then effectively they're just going to blow each other up to kingdom come, right? It's mutually assured destruction. So that concept is deterrent, right? Because if ultimately you're going to have these nuclear exchanges, right, that's deterrence in itself if everyone ends up dead, right? Why would we even be the aggressor if we're just going to end up dead too, right? So you also get this concept called brinkmanship. It's this willingness to go to the brink of war, right? There's a lot of this action, but not actually any further, and that's going to probably be the most demonstrated during the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So here's your map again. Remember, the Iron Curtain kind of falls somewhere along this border here if you were to place it. I can guarantee you there's going to be some sort of political cartoon tomorrow on the test dealing with the Iron Curtain, so hopefully you familiarize yourself with where it is and why it's there, what it's called. Ultimately, just familiarize yourself with the concept of the Iron Curtain. Okay, so continuing on, right, we talked about the Berlin Wall. So effectively, you're also going to get the Berlin crisis that you actually saw in the 1960s documentary that we watched in class, right? And the Berlin crisis is another situation where Nikita Khrushchev, who is the leader of the Soviet Union, decides that he wants one more time to try and test the American president and the West, trying to kind of take control of Berlin, right? So effectively, the Americans don't back down. They say that they're going to continue their post-war commitments, and between this back and forth, the Soviets end up giving up essentially, and instead they just decide to actively wall off East Berlin from the rest of West Berlin, right? And then they're going to start to keep East Germans from fleeing. And you guys watch this video in class. The notes are right there. So if you want to go and watch it again, it's about the different escape attempts. So you also get the space race, right? You have the first people in space. You have the first satellite called Sputnik in 1957. You're going to get the first American satellite not that long after. You're going to get the first cosmonaut. I guess it's not in the slides, but a man named Yuri Gagarin. And the first American in space is a man named Alan Shepard, with the first person to ever orbit is a man named John Glenn. So anyway, moving on, right? You have the collapse of well, this is long down the way now, so don't forget about the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you want to look up on that again, you have the entire 1960s World on the Brink documentary that we watched. The answer key is in Classroom if you don't have it back yet yourself. So you can take a look at those to kind of familiarize yourself with what was going on during the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? But to make a long story short, the Soviets attempt to place missiles in Cuba, and the Americans obviously aren't okay with that, right? So the Americans end up deciding to blockade Cuba and not allow any more ships or anything from the Soviets to make it that way, right? So that the Soviets test that blockade, and they're kind of pushing the brink again, that brinkmanship, that word we were just using before. So they keep pushing that envelope a bit, and the Americans, they reaffirm that they will effectively act if the Soviets go past the blockade, potentially leading into a war and maybe even a nuclear exchanges between the two countries, and the Soviets end up backing down, right? This is Khrushchev versus Kennedy, and they kind of rationally talk things out between them before we actually get to an all-out nuclear war between the two countries. So that's obviously pretty good, right? So we're going to talk more about some leaders and some other events during the Cold War here, but just don't forget that the Soviet Union will eventually collapse. It's going to fail as an economic system in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, partially as a result of a proxy war that's being fought between America and the Soviet Union in Afghanistan after the Soviets invade Afghanistan in 1980. Yeah, so 1979, 1980, I think, if my years are correct. But anyway, so the Soviet Union is gonna have repercussions for this. You're gonna have a Soviet leader that begins to kind of open up to the West, which we'll talk about more in a second. And you're gonna get the tearing down of the Berlin Wall and the USSR falling apart economically and politically, and then effectively NATO expanding, as well as Warsaw Pact countries deciding that they no longer want to be under the Soviet sphere and they want independence themselves. Okay, sorry, I'm about to sneeze. Ooh, excuse me. So anyway, some other big events, and we're going to look at these again too, right? You have the communist takeover in China, you have the Korean conflict, you're going to have the Vietnam War and such, right? So don't forget all those. We got some pictures of the collapse and such, right? So we talked about this already. We'll go more in depth into these in 2 seconds here, okay? So let's keep moving along. So moving into our next one, this is number 3, so let's go to number 2. Alright, so we are starting up. Look at the captions going again. I realize I'm talking fairly quick, but you can watch this as many times as you feel you need to rewind and such. Okay, so we have conflict in Asia that definitely happens, right? And timeline-wise, these notes are kind of a little bit out of order. It probably would make more sense to talk about the fall of, the turning communist in China. So let's do that first before we talk about the Korean War, okay? So you have these different groups in China, right? You're going to have what are called a group of nationalists that are people that are looking to kind of pull away from the Qing dynasty, you know, the kingdom that had existed in China for a couple hundred years. So that was the hope, right? So they effectively are going to be able to throw off the Qing dynasty in the early 1900s in 1911. And unfortunately for them, in the transition, this new government is not going to be that effective in dealing and helping with the people, and people are still going to be living in poverty for the most part, right? So as a result, many Chinese are going to become fairly angry and become interested in the ideas of communism and the communist revolution that was taking place in Russia. And you're going to have a group of Chinese, in particular, led by a man named Mao Zedong, who is going to try to begin to push that mentality and those ideas in China. So ultimately, they come together and they're trying to improve peasants' lives and conditions, and they're going to, these ideas, right, they're going to obviously win the support of many Chinese people that are believing that they're going to help them, right? So at this point, you're going to now have two opposing factions. You have the nationalists who had kind of wrested control from the Qing dynasty, and now you have the communists under Mao, right? And both are kind of wrestling for control of the country, and you're going to get a bit of a civil war in China as a result, right? And this is going to go on for a number of years here until things are not looking necessarily great for the for the communists, kind of leading up into World War II. Mao is going to kind of have to take a number of his followers and kind of run and get away. They're going to kind of lead this long march up into the mountains for thousands of miles to avoid being captured by the nationalistic government and keeping this communist effort going. You know, it's just a quote from Mao. But ultimately, World War II is going to break out, right? And with World War II breaking out, what's going to happen is the Japanese are going to invade China, right? Kind of, well, at least they did before World War II, right? And now they're going to decide that the fight is actually more with the Japanese and for the war versus the fight against themselves, right? And they're going to kind of band together as much as they're willing to anyway to kind of fight against the Japanese and kick the Japanese out of China, right? And now, that's all great and all, but when World War II ends, they're just going to go back to fighting, and you're going to have now, between 1946 and 1949, this continuation of the nationalists fighting the communists in China under a man named Chiang Kai-shek, who is the leader of the nationalists, and then you have Mao Zedong, who is the leader of the communists, right? So, ultimately, the communists are going to prevail, and you're going to have a successful communist revolution in China, again, under Mao Zedong. And on October 1st, 1949, you're going to have the declaration and the creation of the People's Republic of China as a communist country, right? And Mao is going to be appointed the head of China and the Chinese government, had almost complete control over China in doing so. His policies, again, are going to be kind of nationalizing resources, right? So he's going to be taking land and resources from wealthy citizens and giving it to peasants, and pseudo a Robin Hood-esque kind of situation, I suppose. And ultimately, the poor people of China really like this, right? And the wealthy people are not so much going to like that. So anyway, you have, he, again, on some level, just looking to improve the living conditions for the poor, but he's going to go about doing that in not necessarily the greatest ways, and it's going to lead to a lot of issues and a lot of people dying. So that's obviously not that good, right? So anyway, he implements a program in 1958 to organize all farms into what are known as collectives, right? So trying to take all this personal property and organizing it in a way that people will work them together on these collectives, right? That he also looked to create and implement what's called this Great Leap Forward in an attempt to kind of speed up Chinese economic development and industrial development, agricultural development, and effectively, this is going to end up being a disaster, and it's largely as a result, not necessarily, it's kind of out of his hands on some level, but you're going to have some serious droughts and floods in China over these subsequent years. It's going to very much damage the food supply, and when you have a country as large as China, as many mouths to feed, that's obviously very much a problem, right? And as a result, you're going to have about 20 million people dying between 1958 and 1960 in one of the largest famines in all of human history. So that's a bit of a problem, and that's, you know, effectively, again, Mao's policies are going to lead to this fairly directly, actually. Right, so here's just some pictures of these farm collectives. So anyway, you're also going to have what's known as the Cultural Revolution, right? So with the failures of the Great Leap Forward and these giant famines that are going on, many of these peasants and these people in China are going to begin to lose confidence in Mao's leadership, right? And in response, Mao doesn't want to give up this power. That says MAP, but it should say Mao. It created, so he creates what's known as this Cultural Revolution in China, and it's an attempt to stop opposition to the Communist Party, and it stomps down culture that's not Chinese and not communist all around, right? So you're going to have a war essentially against students and schools and ethnic, non-Chinese culture, and people who oppose communism, and it's going to be, again, another crackdown, an authoritarian crackdown, a dictatorial crackdown on the people of China. So this Cultural Revolution is going to kind of create a bit of mass chaos in China for a number of years, almost 10 years, and you're going to have schools and factories not operating. You're going to have people that are being, just they're denied healthcare and transportation and all these different things. So, all right, that all said, China is now communist, and we are going to have some issues in Korea that pop up too not long later, right? So we remember that during World War II, Japan had occupied many of these colonies in Asia, right? So you're going to have, so Japan had come over to Korea. They're going to take parts of Manchuria and China as well. As far as imperialism goes before the war, sorry, this was the better map that I wanted. You can see where they're going to kind of take prior to Pearl Harbor anyway. Right, they're even going to end up down in Southeast Asia, and Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and such, okay? And then even during the war after Pearl Harbor, they're going to expand even farther into Indonesia, down in New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Marshall Islands, and such, right? So they expand their empire all the way in the Pacific, which is kind of what we already just talked about for a number of days during the World War II Union. So to not bore you guys any further, here we go. So following the war, Korea, right, is going to effectively need to be administered now by the winning powers, right? So America and even China. North Korea is going to be kind of given over to the Soviets, right? And it's going to be given to them to administer the north part of the area. South Korea is going to be controlled by the Americans and the Allies, right? So it creates this dividing line in Korea at what's called the 38th parallel, or the 38th degree latitude. And you're going to have this border, right? So here's the thing. In 1949, both of these powers are going to kind of withdraw, and they're going to leave North Korea and South Korea to their own devices. The Soviets kind of continue to influence North Korea quite a bit, and they give them supplies and weapons and tanks, and with that, I guess with that confidence from those things, North Korea is going to decide that they're going to push into South Korea, and they're going to attempt to unify the entire peninsula. So they almost do, actually. The surprise attack on South Korea is very effective, and it penetrates very deep into the South, right? And at this point, Truman, who was president, his policies and the idea of the Truman Doctrine and this idea of containment are going to be tested, right? And what's going to happen is that South Korea is going to be kind of stuck, and they're going to ask the United Nations, which they were a part of, to intervene, right? And you're going to have now a United Nations army, 15 different countries under the main Allied general, the American general from World War II, Douglas MacArthur, and they're going to kind of push in an army mostly led by Americans, but again containing all of these different people, to push back against the North Koreans to try to gain control of the peninsula, right? So we looked at this video, so I'm going to bring that back up because it does a really good job again at kind of the flow of things, right? So let's take a look, right? The North is going to invade the South, and it's going to happen pretty rapidly. They're going to push them all the way down to the southeast at a place called Busan, okay? So then, effectively, you're going to get the UN to come in and intervene, and they're going to get all the way to the north. They're going to push all the way back up. So this is where things get really dicey, okay? What happens is the Chinese warn the Americans and the UN to basically not come any farther. There's a river up here, and effectively they said if you get any closer, we are going to be forced to act. So MacArthur decides to call their bluff, and the Chinese weren't lying. So all of a sudden you have hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers kind of come across the border and push the Americans and the UN forces all the way back to the southern end of Korea, and it's going to take a number of months and even years to kind of battle back up to more or less where we actually started this whole thing in the first place, right? So it's kind of a whole waste on some level, because yes, I suppose containment was effective, I suppose, in stopping the communism and stopping the fall of the dominoes, but we're going to have millions of Korean civilians and millions of people that are going to be killed, and thousands of American soldiers for essentially no change in where we were, right? So it's kind of this waste on some level, if you ask me. So when MacArthur got pushed all the way back, he actually was upset about it and called for a nuclear attack. Harry Truman more or less said, no, we're not going to use nukes in this situation. It's kind of absurd, and in fact, because of his blunder, he's going to actually end up firing Douglas MacArthur, which is this whole big deal considering he was this huge World War II hero, but he does. So you're going to have 2 more years of fighting. You're going to get a ceasefire in 1953. The war technically does not end here. It's just a ceasefire. In fact, I believe only recently that this war is officially technically over. So it went on that long, I suppose, even though there was no active fighting between them. But you're going to have this border set at the 38th parallel, and you're going to have what's known as a DMZ, or demilitarized zone, created on either side of the border, right, between North and South Korea. They're obviously very different today. South Korea is doing very, very well. It's this democratic country that does very well for themselves on the international stage and things like that. And North Korea, we know, has its issues, and you can look into that as much as you want under Kim Jong-un and the family, the Un family, sorry, the Kim family, I'm sorry, that actually that took control in North Korea. Anyway, right, so that's that, right? So we're back to I'm going to move on here because... Okay, so now we need to talk about Vietnam, and we're going to talk about it fairly quickly because we again watched a fairly long documentary, so I can kind of sum things up. But ultimately, here we go. So we know that Vietnam is going to end up being another of these proxy wars from the Cold War era, right? So the start date is kind of tricky to pin down exactly, but I guess we're saying here by 1957 to 1975 is when this conflict exists, right? And initially, Vietnam was a French colony. It was for a very long time, 1887 to 1954, before they're officially going to be kind of kicked out by the Vietnamese. They're led by the communists and a man named Ho Chi Minh, who is effectively their figurehead. Also, a big part of their leading body early on in this whole thing. And Vietnam is going to be divided, right? You're going to end up with this communist North Vietnam and this democratic South Vietnam, not so dissimilar to the Korea situation we just talked about, right? North Vietnam is going to want to actually unite these two parts into one country, and even push, into the South, attempting to do so. So this is again where the policy of containment kicks in, right? And the Americans had been fairly successful in Korea, I suppose. So in doing that, right, they're going to believe that they can kind of do it all over again, and you're going to get their involvement in the Vietnam conflict, especially as they had been backing the French, and when the French are not able to actively do this and able to win, I suppose, against the North Vietnamese, that's when the United States is going to be drawn even farther into the conflict, right? So again, as far as specifics for the Vietnam War, you're going to learn a whole lot more about that in U.S. history next year. We watched, a good first part of the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary that I think does a really good job at setting the stage for the war and what things were like and conditions were like in the country. So if you're interested in that at all, continue watching that series. But ultimately, the United States is going to be forced to withdraw its forces, and the war is going to continue, and North Vietnam will eventually be able to actually unify the entire country under the communist ideology here in 1975. Okay, so as far as where Vietnam is in the world, you know what? Let's take a look in Google Maps. I'm going to bring it up here in 2 seconds, and then we're going to finish up. Shouldn't be much more than 10 more minutes at this point. All right, so here is our Google map, right? Just so we get our idea of where things are in the world, right? We have Japan here, so that's why they're able to come in and take over some of these parts from an imperialistic perspective. So that's where North Korea is, and South Korea, right? The Chinese were able to come down through here. So now Vietnam is more Southeast Asia, right? And it's going to be down this way. Vietnam is here, okay? So just for a perspective in the world, I think it's always good to take a look at the geography of the situation, all right? So, yeah, so we talked about the policies of No Din Diem. As well from the video, and his persecution against Buddhists and the self-immolation, right? We talked about the atrocities that were happening in napalm and all of that stuff as well. We talked about this picture, which is a really interesting one. Whereas this man is undoubtedly a war criminal here, but you can make whatever narrative you really want from the picture, right? And that's what's going to happen in Vietnam on some level. You're going to have the first major war in American history that's going to be broadcasted live to people's living rooms, right? And that's where you're going to get this divisiveness and this division between people agreeing with the war versus the anti-war crowd. And we listened to a whole bunch of the anti-war protest songs, from the era too. So anyway, we have to eventually leave because things kind of fall apart, and public support for the war definitely dwindles toward the end. On top of Nixon being effectively having to resign and would have been removed from office because of Watergate. So it's a very tumultuous time period in American history as well in the late 1960s and early 1970s. So that's going to be one of the reasons why we are having to get out of Vietnam as well. Right, so let me bring up the third. Even though these are kind of the notes, I'm going to bring it up from the classroom, so that way you guys can see what I'm doing here, and it's also specifically that, right? So now we're getting down to the end here. So at that point, what I'd like to do is I'd like to mention the extra credit, right? So this past weekend, I always default back to track here, but I guess this past weekend the track team was at the Penn Relays, and they set a new school record in the 4x800. So I'm going to ask you that you would need to know the time that they ran specifically for this, okay? So the time, if you are ready, is 7 minutes, 53 seconds, .53, okay? 7 minutes, 53 seconds, .53 is your answer to the extra credit tomorrow. So now let's look at the world leaders, okay? So we literally talked about this in class today for some of you, so we really shouldn't have to go into it too much. It's really the other stuff that need to be refreshed a whole lot more, I think. So we're just going to breeze through this, right? So we had Indira Gandhi, who is this first female Indian prime minister between 1966 and 1977. She's going to kind of establish this close relationship with the Soviet Union, between India and the Soviet Union, as I just said, during the Cold War. They developed this trade partnership, and under her they're going to develop the nuclear program in India as well, right? Just as a fun little fact, the name of the first atomic bomb in India is the Smiling Buddha. Right, she's not related to Mohandas Gandhi, and she's going to be assassinated. Right, so I know Ms. Kipperman talked about this in a lot more detail today and yesterday. So I'm going to again breeze through this to let you guys on your way. Right, we also talked about Margaret Thatcher. Right, Margaret Thatcher was a female prime minister and British prime minister. She is known for kind of free trade and less government regulation, so a bit of more of a conservative mindset. She does establish this kind of closer relationship with the United States, and therefore kind of adopts similar foreign policy as the United States, and under her she's going to assert the United Kingdom's military power a little bit, right? She's going to develop this nickname as a result called the Iron Lady for her, as it's written here, this unflinching politics, right? There is an attempted assassination by the the Irish Republican Army from Northern Ireland as a result of her policies in Ireland. It's not going to be successful, right? You also have the Falklands War, which we didn't necessarily talk about, but you can look up if you are really interested. There's a bit of a fight and a conflict between the British and Argentina. So you also have Mikhail Gorbachev, right? Do I have a picture? I do. So he is the president of the Soviet Union. He's going to be the last, essentially, leader of the Soviet Union in leading into their dissolution. But excuse me again. So ultimately, he pushes forth these two kind of policies. The first is known as glasnost, which is this openness to political discussion and government transparency associated with this new freedom of speech that didn't really exist in the Soviet Union, right? So with people now being able to kind of look on the outward and seeing different government structures and systems and having open political discussions and seeing their own political government with more transparency, effectively, that's going to have people begin to really question things, right? So when you have now this other implementation of what's called perestroika, with this political and economic restructuring kind of more in line with capitalistic ideals here or there, and on top of the fall of the Berlin Wall, you're going to have the collapse of the Soviet Union, the USSR, on December 26, 1991, and their subsequent dissolution. Right? So you're also going to have Deng Xiaoping, who is the last of the leaders that you need to be familiar with. He is the party chairman in China during his reign. He's going to kind of attempt to reform the economy in China, kind of more toward a open, more market economy, and in doing so, it's going to kind of lead to some rapid economic growth in China, because when you open up this market economy to these hundreds of millions of people in China, things can pretty rapidly expand for a moment, right? So you have the Communist Party retaining control of the government, but a little bit more openness, I guess, under Deng Xiaoping, right? He's going to be this primary architect of China's modernization. Okay, so on that note, that is all for tonight. So thank you for being here, and thank you for bearing with me. I hope you guys got something out of it, and from that point, good luck with the rest of your studying. So have a good night.